Mass immigration has been a very divisive political topic over the past decades and has come to a boiling point in the U.S. The open border agenda of our government has been made clear with their deliberate policy of refusing to secure our borders and funding NGOs to facilitate the arrival of tens of millions of legal and illegal migrants from all over the world. We can argue about their motivations, but one thing is clear: it must stop, and it is time we identify and hold these organizations accountable. We need a Black Lives Matter-like movement to energize activism against these orgs who act in their own self-interest through the guise of philanthropy. A defund the NGOs campaign that puts pressure on elected officials to stop using our resources to support mass immigration. In this video, I will focus on one of the many major organizations that receives millions in taxpayer money to facilitate mass immigration into America. The nonprofit company Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, now rebranded as Global Refuge, was founded in 1939 to help resettle European refugees after World War II. They have roots going back to the 1860s with organizations that helped Lutheran migrants settle in the U.S. Lutheran communities and churches were established by early German migrants that helped build this country, but it has been hijacked by leftist ideologues who want to make the U.S. an international welfare hub that promotes a pluralistic worldview. Pluralism practiced on the scale by the U.S. in recent years has been a reckless experiment and has led to increasing political factionalism, cultural strife, and the legitimization of radical right-wing movements. From the Journal of Lutheran Ethics, we are given some historical context on NGOs like Global Refuge surrounding their involvement in pro-immigration policy and advocacy. Who defines who is the neighbor in need, the government or the church? In the early 1980s, refugees began fleeing through Mexico to the United States. For foreign policy reasons, U.S. government policy was not to recognize them as refugees and to send them back. The sanctuary movement arose in the United States, using civil disobedience to seek to protect refugees from being deported back to life-threatening danger and to protest U.S. policy. What should leaders do? First off, referring again to the parable of the Good Samaritan, the churches and Leaders Board decided that we are called to serve the neighbor in need, regardless of whether the government has invited that person to enter the United States. Next, the board decided that leaders would affirm those congregations and individuals who take the serious decision to engage in civil disobedience, but that leaders itself would operate within the law while advocating for a change to the law. Finally, leaders established a program of assistance for asylum seekers working through a network of legal and social service providers along the borders and in the major cities. This program continues to this day. So they decided, through their own moral authority, not democracy, that they were going to be the arbitrators of U.S. immigration policy going forward. And we will see how their history of radical activism has been rewarded in present times. Our current border policy, after the Remain in Mexico statute was allowed to expire, has allowed immigrants to enter illegally who claim asylum to stay in the U.S. until they have a hearing, which takes years due to their large numbers. This means anyone who enters illegally should and will claim asylum, and thus will be treated preferentially as a refugee instead of a criminal. This allows migrants to circumvent the difficult legal process and gives NGOs leverage to advocate for more humanitarian aid, since it is our moral prerogative to help all persecuted peoples around the world. This is the mission of Global Refuge, as stated on their website. As a witness to God's love for all people, we stand with and advocate for immigrants and refugees, transforming communities through ministries of service and justice. They also have a DEI statement. Grounded in our faith, we believe everyone should be celebrated and valued for their unique life experiences. We believe diverse opinions, ideas, and beliefs are the foundation of a healthy organization and flourishing society. Our history of welcome is inspiration for a workplace that honors all. This type of language is typical of the many NGOs who lobby for immigration and follows the woke culture that has taken over our institutions. Their progressive ideology is based around converting American communities and culture to suit the needs of immigrants. They are driven to serve migrants and refugees over the needs of Americans, through hundreds of millions of dollars that is provided by taxpayer money. Many people do not see Christian NGOs as left-wing political activists, but that is exactly what this organization has become, and they use religion as a shield to avoid criticism. The Heritage Foundation reported in 2023 on NGOs who received large federal grants the following. In its 2021 financial statement, Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, or Global Refuge, reported it received more than $93 million in U.S. government grants and $23 million in church, foundation, corporate, and other contributions, making taxpayer-funded grants more than 80% of its total support. In fiscal year 2022, the Department of Health and Human Services alone issued the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service a whopping $182 million in grants for unaccompanied alien children and refugee services. Global Refuge continues to receive large grants, and in 2024 reported receiving over $220 million. Why is the federal government so generous to them? It must be extremely important for the well-being of Americans. It is clear from their appointment of Krish Vignaraja as president and CEO where their political loyalties lie. Krish is the president and CEO of Global Refuge and is the first non-Lutheran to lead the organization. She previously served in the Obama White House as policy director for First Lady Michelle Obama and at the State Department as senior advisor under Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and John Kerry. At the State Department, she coordinated development and implementation of multiple programs, including those concerning refugees and migration, engagement with religious communities, the legal dimensions of U.S. foreign policy, and regional issues relating to Africa and the Middle East. She worked closely with USAID, Health and Human Services, and the Department of Defense. It is interesting to note that following her hire in 2019, the funds Global Refuge received went up from $37 million in 2019 to $222 million in 2024. It's almost like she was hired based off her political influence within the State Department and the HHS. During her tenure at Global Refuge, the Refugee Resettlement Agency filed litigation against the Trump administration, challenging the legality of Executive Order 13888, which seeks to give state and local officials the authority to opt out of refugee resettlement in their jurisdictions. In an interview with NPR, Vignaraja described the policy as cruel and short-sighted, and noted that refugees that have been waiting to be reunited with their families for years may be forced to settle hundreds of miles away. Their goal is to force state officials who are democratically elected to accept refugees against the will of their constituents. The executive order requires consent from the people. The order states that the program should resettle refugees only in those jurisdictions in which both the state and local governments have consented to receive refugees under the Department of State's Reception and Placement Program. This subversion of democracy is typical of the leftist activists who place their political moral crusade over the needs and wants of American communities. The HHS policy states, recipients of federal funds are not allowed to use federal funding to lobby federal, state, or local officials, or their staff to receive additional funding or influence legislation. But I guess hiring HHS policy advisors doesn't count as lobbying for influence, nor does suing the federal government for the enforcement of their political agendas. It is no mystery why Americans feel like they are being replaced when you have a foreign-born activist running billion-dollar government-funded operations who say things like this. Our superpower, as a superpower, is immigration. America has an aging population and the lowest birth rate since the census started tracking it. She shares, we have a federal debt north of $35 trillion, and we face a climate crisis that is estimated to cost us tens of trillions per year in the next couple of decades. We need every tool in our toolkit to combat those challenges. That means we need our superpower. Whites in America will be a minority by 2050, which means less and less political and cultural representation for the issues they, the original immigrants from Europe who built this country, value most. Of course, a Sri Lankan could care less about white representation in a country that hosts the largest immigrant population in world history. But it's never enough to satisfy people like her and organizations like Global Refuge. We need more and more immigration until we are no longer capable of exercising our superpower. According to the Brookings Institution, the new statistics project that the nation will become minority white in 2045. During that year, whites will comprise 49.7% of the population. Minorities will be the source of all of the growth in the nation's youth and working age population, most of the growth in its voters, and much of the growth in its consumers and tax base as far into the future as we can see. Taking all this into account, I can only conclude that Global Refuge needs to be defunded and the government agencies propping them up dismantled, or at the very least investigated. They are one of many tools used by our institutions to push mass immigration onto the American people against their will. They and their institutional puppets hold us hostage by fear-mongering about white supremacy, the economy, and labor shortages, while ignoring legitimate concerns about the future of our great nation. Hopefully, the tide is turning with Trump back in the White House after many of us have experienced the consequences of the instituted immigration crisis. We will see soon if RFK Jr.'s appointment to the Department of Health and Human Services goes through, and if it does, what impact he can have on the funding of NGOs like Global Refuge. But we must stay vigilant and critical of all administrations, Republican or Democrat, to ensure they are not pulling the wool over our eyes. And you can always count on NGOs like Global Refuge to play victim and fight to the death against the political wills of the American people.